Amazing. Bonsoir. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me well. So we had more than 350 registrations for this event tonight, which really sets a record and makes it the biggest event we've ever hosted online. So this is incredible, and I'm excited to introduce Carolyn Campbell to you in just a little while. And I'm sure we are all very much looking forward to listening about the legendary necropolis, which attracts millions of visitors every year, the fascinating Père-Lachaise. I would also like to thank all those of you who supported this event tonight. There have been really so many of you, and it would be impossible for me to mention or to acknowledge each one of you by name, which we will do in our newsletter. It will come out after the Thanksgiving, and please let us know if you would like to stay anonymous. Anyways, a huge thank you, un grand merci to your support, to your very, very generous support. It means a lot to us in these difficult and still uncertain times, and it allows us to continue offering our cultural programs to you. And so tonight we have the pleasure of hosting Carolyn Campbell, a DC native, a published author, and exhibited photographer who will be presenting her best-selling nonfiction book, City of Immortals, Père-Lachaise Cemetery, Paris. And here's the cover for those of you who haven't seen it. It's amazing with lots of very beautiful illustrations throughout the book. Carolyn was born in Washington, D.C. She lived in Paris, and she's now residing in LA, so she really crossed the world. And she's now, as far as I understand, connected from LA. She graduated from Maryland Institute College of Art, and she has held various positions here in DC, including Corcoran Gallery of Art, where she mentioned in the 80s her fascination with Père-Lachaise began. She also worked for the American Film Institute and for UCLA School of Art and Architecture. She is currently working as an arts and communications specialist and lecturing about City of Immortals. Okay, I will give it to you now, Carolyn. And so I'll be helping you with the slides. Let me share my screen and we will be all set.
Thank you, Natasha. It's wonderful to be here this evening. And thanks to everyone for coming. And my deepest appreciation in particular to the Alliance Française Executive Director, Sarah Diligenti, and of course, Natasha Zabitskaya and Dr. Kitson Pantano, who also lent some support early on. No cemetery is more rewarding and historically significant than Père-Lachaise. It's in the far eastern section of the city. For those who are familiar, it's the 20th arrondissement. It's one of the most idyllic places. A forest, really, in the middle of the city. There are 5,000 trees. In the fall, it's a festival of color, and the sounds of songbirds overhead. In spring, there is a sweet smell of chestnut blossoms. And it's also the largest green space in Paris. Though it is a modern garden-style cemetery, it's also very urban. There's 107 acres of cityscape with winding streets, pathways, intersections, and directional signs. It became a model for cemeteries as a place to stroll, a fusion of nature, sculpture, and memory. It brings to mind one of my favorite quotes by Honoré de Balzac, who is buried there. And he says, "I seldom go out, but when I feel myself flagging, I go out and cheer myself up in Père-Lachaise. While seeking out the dead, I see nothing but the living." Before we go on a tour of the cemetery, I want to go back in time to how I became a passionate Francophile. I have my hometown of Washington, D.C., and the beloved Corcoran Gallery of Art to thank for that. I grew up in Washington, as Natasha mentioned, and I flew my kite under the 500-foot tall marble obelisk that is the Washington Monument, and ran alongside the football field length of the reflecting pool many summers. I didn't know really until high school that the city was planned by a Frenchman, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. He was responsible for the elegant design of the mall and its wide boulevards for strolling and gardens bordered at one end by the Potomac River. It formed the perfect backdrop for great monuments celebrating history and culture. At age 8, I would take the bus west, past the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, and turn onto 17th Street to the Corcoran Gallery of Art, where I went to the Saturday's children's art classes. I was in awe of what revered American architect Frank Lloyd Wright called the greatest example of Beaux-Arts architecture in the United States. Who could have imagined that many years later, I was hired as the museum's first director of public relations and special events? I got to create receptions for the visiting dignitaries and hold press previews for exhibitions set in the impressive 40-foot tall atrium space with its Doric colonnade. Many of you Washingtonians may recall the elaborate receptions at the Corcoran. Here I am in the 1970s in the museum's 18th century French neoclassical style Salon Doré. You may also remember the museum's collection of Barbizon school painter Camille Corot that hung in the rotunda, yet another French connection for me. It was during a staff meeting at the museum when the conservator, Robert Wiles, who moonlighted as a travel agent, said, "Carolyn, a person on a charter has just canceled, and do you want a ticket? All you need to do is pay the tax and you're off to Paris." Well, needless to say, that was a yes. I hurriedly made plans for my first trip to France. That same week, an artist at an exhibition opening heard I was planning to go to Paris. He knew that Oscar Wilde was my favorite literary hero and told me that his ancestor, Sir Jacob Epstein, sculpted the monument marking Wilde's burial place. I had my first destination. And this is where the story begins. On my first visit to Père-Lachaise in 1981, I became enthralled with the cemetery's rich history and artistic significance. I vowed to return as soon as possible. So in 1982, I commissioned a colleague, British photographer Joe Cornish, to join me and create what I envisioned to be a nostalgic photo album of this Elysium of the afterlife. 3 decades later, we are still captivated by its ever-changing beauty and mystery. When I told Joe that we had a book deal, he quipped, "I'd hoped we might publish our work about Père-Lachaise before we were buried there." I discovered that Joe and I were not the only ones in love with the cemetery. It is known as the most famous resting place in the world and welcomes 3.5 million visitors each year. It's the 4th most popular site in Paris after Notre Dame, the Eiffel Tower, and the Arc de Triomphe. However, it has been closed due to the pandemic and only briefly allowed funerals. Now, with the second lockdown in France, only those who live within a kilometer of the cemetery are allowed to visit. So what was the genesis for this cemetery in the first place? Over the centuries, war and the devastation of the plague had already filled the catacombs and church graveyards across Paris, the traditional burial places. There was an incident one day when a heavy rain caused a major flood and a shared wall of the Cemetery of Innocents and an adjacent building collapsed, spilling thousands of corpses into the homes of the unsuspecting apartment dwellers. 18th century Parisian engineers had overlooked one significant question in their urban design scheme: what to do with the ever-increasing population of the dead. Those apartment residents and many other citizens complained bitterly to the young new first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon directed his engineers solve the problem. Nicolas Frochot, the prefect of the Seine, proposed holding a competition to create new cemeteries on the outskirts of the city. The first ever commission of its kind was awarded to architect, landscape, and urban designer Alexander Theodore Brogniart. However, people weren't really thrilled about the long trek out to the countryside for burial and visitation. And the bishops were not really thrilled with the idea of losing money, but the church had no choice. They had run out of room. Frochot had a keen sense of how to appeal to the masses by creating something intriguing. He convinced Napoleon of a plan to win over the critics, as well as the hesitant clientele, by naming the cemetery after Father Lachaise, the Jesuit confessor to the popular Sun King Louis XIV. He launched an inventive real estate promotion, filling the cemetery with sculptures and the remains of the famous and the infamous, including Molière and La Fontaine, and the ill-fated 12th century lovers Heloise and Abelard. The cachet of the place was set. The grand opening of Père-Lachaise was held on May 21st, 1804. We have the 19th century architects to thank for moving away from the Christian-dominated imagery of a cemetery as macabre sadness and a frightful place filled with dead bodies, to a more pantheistic view of a cemetery that reflects a more peaceful concept of a sweet rest. After all, the earliest interpretation of the word cimetière was a place where one sleeps. Étienne Louis Boullé, one of the most admired architects of the period, and the mentor of Brongniart, was a proponent of the pre-Romantic celebration of the divinity in nature. Brongniart carried out this concept in his revolutionary garden-style plan that has stood as a model for cemeteries throughout the US and Europe, including Highgate Cemetery in London and Rock Creek and Oak Hill cemeteries in Washington, DC. Let's look at the map to get our bearings as we walk through the cemetery. Remember this layout as we start at the very bottom. You'll see just above the little bat figure on the border. That is the front entrance on Boulevard Ménilmontant in the darkest color shading. That area denotes the oldest section, founded in 1804. Étienne Good served as the chief architect of the city of Paris in the early 1800s. Known for his neoclassical designs, he designed the main Boulevard Ménilmontant entrance to Père-Lachaise, which consists of an elongated horseshoe-shaped driveway with a pair of tall central gates topped by two carved medallions. These bear the classic funerary symbols of the torch representing life's flame and the winged hourglass symbolizing the passing of time. As you enter these massive gates and walk up the main aisle, Avenue Principale, you pass the graves of writer Colette and Louis Visconti, the architect of the Louvre. At the end of the avenue, one encounters the monumental sculpture Aux Morts, or To the Dead. Created by artist Paul Albert Bartholomé, it was originally designed as a tribute to his wife. The monument features a mournful procession of 20 men, women, and children marching toward an immense dark doorway into the next life. The site also serves as an ossuary that contains the remains of thousands of Parisians. You'll see the two small doors to the right. That is the entrance to the ossuary. When other cemeteries in the city were closed, or when people's graves in Père-Lachaise were claimed due to negligence or lack of rent payment, remains were placed in the ossuary. French architect Hector Guimard designed the only completely Art Nouveau tombs in the cemetery. These are one of my personal favorites. They're breathtaking to be. They're right inside that main entrance and off to the right. His atelier's signature appears in the lower right corner near the back of the dove gray marble tomb. Guimard was strongly influenced by Eugene Viollet-le-Duc's ideas about ornamental structures. Guimard is also best known for his entrance to the metro stations throughout Paris, including the Père-Lachaise metro station, which has that distinctive lettering, arch signage, and curvaceous metalwork on the railings. And I recommend to anyone who does have the opportunity to visit the cemetery to walk around the tombs and look for things like this. Many times the sculptor or the architect's atelier will have their signature hidden in the piece. One of my favorite areas of the cemetery has a significant landscape history before Brongniart applied his design scheme. The original 16-acre site was the Jesuit retreat of Father Lachaise, previously called Mont Louis. Yes, there are mountains in Paris. Others are Montmartre and Montparnasse. Mont Louis, a 1,000-foot elevation, creates quite a challenging hike when you visit the cemetery. As you can see here, the bucolic site was planted with lemon groves, rose gardens, tree arbors, and many winding paths ideally suited to the contemplative life of its former inhabitants. It is now called the cemetery's romantic section, which was the original area founded in 1804, and now serves as a resting place for luminaries such as composers Bellini, Cherubini, and Chopin. And I want to point out in this particular image of Frédéric Chopin, this is Joe Cornish's shot taken on his first visit in 1982. And it was just at dusk, and none of us, for all the years we've revisited, have never been able to duplicate the glory of this shot on All Souls Day, when all the visitors have left votive lights and garlands and floral offerings. It's quite moving to see the tombs at this time of year. Brochenard died in 1813, so many of his grand schemes never made it off the drawing board, including his dream of a monumental pyramid as a focal point in the cemetery. Historians have been fascinated with Egyptian civilization since antiquity. In France, this obsession was highlighted by Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Obelisks and pyramids, which appeared on buildings all over Europe, became a permanent feature throughout Père-Lachaise. Today is a charming mix of structures with elegantly styled crypts next to oversized mansions of the dead encircled by rows and rows of modest headstones, creating the effect of an enchanted architectural theme park. The architectural designs in Père-Lachaise represent an encyclopedic grouping of many periods. You would have to zigzag to every corner of Paris to find such a comprehensive collection of the city's important sculptors and architecture, representing many periods and styles of art and design from early Roman times to the present. Fortunately, the tombs in Père-Lachaise parallel the city's artistic growth and houses all these styles. Brochenard's original plan was complemented over the ensuing decades by hundreds of individual tombs created by an impressive roster of designers, sculptors, and architects, many of whom were credited with creating the significant urban plan and public structures throughout Paris. Some of those individuals are interred within the cemetery. Charles Percier, along with his architectural associate Pierre Fontaine, are interred together in the far eastern part of the romantic section. Their site marked by a tall stele topped with a funerary image of an urn with the symbol of the Masons incised in the stone panel at its base. They were largely responsible for the popularity of the Empire style of the era. One of the numerous projects Napoleon hired them to design was the grandly arcaded stretch of housing on Rue de Rivoli, the second longest street in Paris, opposite the Louvre. Considered one of the first theorists of modern architecture, Viollet-le-Duc was a noted scholar, restorer of medieval buildings, and a central figure in the revival of Gothic architecture, as well as the author of a 10-volume history of French architecture. He won the commission with a colleague to restore the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Viollet-le-Duc used himself as the model for St. Thomas the Apostle on the entrance facade. This was a widespread practice with which I have personal experience. My maternal ancestor, Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, one of George Washington's generals, is featured seated to the right of Washington, standing on the east pediment of the US Capitol in Washington, DC. However, his figure sports the face of Philadelphia architect Thomas Walter, who designed the Capitol building. So I know that's my ancestor, but now everyone else does. That's Nathaniel Greene there. Upon completing the Notre Dame project, Viollet-le-Duc became chief of the Bureau of Historic Monuments. That same government office now oversees the city's preservation of all its cemeteries. He also took commissions for various tombs and monuments, including the ornate mausoleum of the Duc de Mornay in Père-Lachaise. Evidence of the architect's vast knowledge of design is displayed in this elaborate collaboration. A tribute to the language of stone and form, though its many layered finials, it may appear to some more like an aging wedding cake, but it is truly a magnificent building. But I think that Viollet-le-Duc probably introduced every style he had under his command into this one mausoleum. Built in 1894 and designed by Jean-Camille Formigé, the Columbarium comes from the word columba, Latin for dove, and originally referred to the compartmentalized housing for doves and pigeons. On some days, a plume of smoke spirals up from the chimney that you see in the background, signaling the operation of its crematorium. To have one's ashes placed in the columbarium, one can choose an underground vault or a niche for small urns in the two-tiered loggia, which is placed outdoors. To access burial niches on the upper tier, one uses the ornate ladder. Several cultural icons rest here, including Isadora Duncan and writer Richard Wright. There's many more. I just named a few. Many others were there as well. Patrons often paired architects with sculptors when commissioning a tomb. Artist David Donge produced some 56 sculptures throughout Père-Lachaise. These include the equestrian monument to General Jacques-Nicolas Gaubert and the bronze bust of the novelist Honoré de Balzac. Sculptor Antoine Etex has numerous examples of his work throughout Paris, including Père-Lachaise. He was commissioned to create the rectangular panel sculptures of peace and resistance on the top of either side of the east facade of the Arc de Triomphe. These and other high-profile commissions established his stellar reputation. However, his most famous work is the tomb he designed for fellow artist Theodore Géricault with bas-reliefs of the painter's artworks, including the raft of the Medusa on its base. That's the front panel that you see. When visiting the cemetery, make sure to look for the signature of Etex under the bronze pillow where Géricault's left arm rests. Etex also designed the family tomb of Francois Vincent Raspail, who was jailed for his participation in the 1848 revolution. Etex depicts sorrow via the poignant artwork titled Madame Raspail's Farewell to the Jailed Revolutionary. The ghost of Madame Raspail stretches her arm out from beneath her shroud toward a barred window. This is a phenomenal piece. I was mentioning to Natasha, around the Grande Ronde, which is a centerpiece in the Old Romantic section. This piece is just north of that sculpture, so make sure to pass by when you're there. Léon Valdoyer was one of the Romantic Beaux-Arts architects of the 19th century, and he won the commission with sculptor Donge to design the tomb of Napoleon's general Maximilien Sebastian Foy. It's an elegant Greek Doric monument with Foy's figure in the center. Valdoyer was part of the group known in Paris as a company of romantic radicals. Their projects often elicited the disapproval of the conservative Beaux-Arts academics. Controversy followed artists as well as architects, and the American-born sculptor Sir Jacob Epstein caused a stir with his monument to Oscar Wilde. He carved the tomb from a 20-ton monolith extracted from an English quarry. It presented an enormous challenge to the artist, who spent 9 months carving the stone on site without referring to preliminary smaller models. A nude winged sphinx, the crown on the figure's head, and the hairstyle are reminiscent of the winged Assyrian bulls in the British Museum, which date to 710 to 705 BC. The Wilde sculpture was one of Epstein's earliest commissions, made possible through the patronage of Helen Carew, a member of Wilde's circle. The work received high praise following the press preview, but due to its prominent male parts, was condemned as indecent. Epstein's work on the Strand in London was also criticized due to the highly sensual modeling of the nude figures. The sculpture on Wilde's tomb was at one point covered with a tarp by the French police. It was the last scandal attributed to the revered writer. Many pilgrims come to the cemetery bearing memories to leave at the grave sites: flowers, photos, a personal item, letters, even the occasional marijuana joint at the grave of Jim Morrison of The Doors. And small pebbles, a Jewish tradition signifying having visited a loved one, as seen on the grave of Gertrude Stein. And for those who know her life partner, Alice B. Toklas's name is on the back of the tombstone. Beside the tombs of writers, such as Saadi Hadayat, a new tradition has recently sprung up: a small jar filled with pens and pencils, both as a symbol for the scribe interred, as well as, I suspect, a ready implement should one want to jot down a thought to leave behind. My own desire to speak directly with the departed is what inspired me to create what is the heart of the book, called The Conversations. I chose 8 cultural icons and asked them about their triumphs and failures, as well as any wisdom they wanted to share with us above ground. The eternal staying power and drama of funerary monuments appealed to the architects and artists who contributed to the mesmerizing environment of Père-Lachaise. Their use of funerary symbols like draped urns, hourglasses, bats, skulls, and mourning figures not only echoed the styling of societal tastes, but also delivered on the promise of visceral awe and wonder in the land of the dead. Bats on tombs illustrated the eerie side of eternity. I personally happen to have a collection of about 30 different bats, but we were time limited, so you've got two of my favorites. Skeletons and skulls, or other death symbols, remind the viewer that death is a part of life and unavoidable. Winged figures slowly replace the death head or soul effigy. These figures are generally considered angels. The word angel comes from the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. The chief duty of an angel was to carry messengers from God. Statues of women in the 18th century often represented the 7 virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity. Powerful examples of how women are seen to embody some of the deepest qualities of the human condition. In Père-Lachaise, there are a few scantily clad female figures. Family members, unaware of a sculptural commission, sometimes must have been pretty alarmed to arrive at the gravesite and discover a half-naked damsel in apparent erotic rapture, then rather in deep mourning. So at Père-Lachaise, we are confronted with the great paradox of this vast burial ground, which embraces serenity, horror, anguish, and acceptance, the grand sweep of the human experience. Day after day, year after year, the city of immortals awaits its next visitors. Thank you.
So, yeah, so we have a few questions, and I'll start. One of the first question was, who is the statue on the cover of the book?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that. And of course, the note is across the room, but I'll try with memory. Oh, wait a minute. I have the book here. I can even look it up in my own book. It is it's a matter of fact, it is in the 58th division. There are 97 divisions in the cemetery. And this is a sculpture that commemorates the French architect and his wife. The seated woman featured on the cover is by sculptor Louis Ernest Barrias and marks the tomb of French government architect Antoine Guerneau and his wife Jean. There you go.
Carolyn Chang is asking, is Louis XIV's confessor, Père-Lachaise, buried at the cemetery? And if so, what does its grave look like?
No, it was long before Père-Lachaise was established. I bet Nicolas Frochot would have loved to have gotten his remains and used it as a publicity angle, but no, Father Lachaise died many years prior to the founding, so he is not there.
Kathleen Brown wants to know if you know why people started leaving lipstick kisses on Oscar Wilde's tomb. She's not sure whether it's still a thing, but it appears to have started sometimes in the early 2000s.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I had the fortunate encounter with the grandson of Oscar Wilde. Merlin Holland was giving a lecture here in Los Angeles. And I asked him about that because as someone who has worked in a museum, concern for sculpture is a very high priority. And it turns out, according to Merlin Holland, he said that the oil in the lipstick, he knew that it was a sign of affection and love for Oscar Wilde, but the oil in the lipstick was seeping into the soft limestone, and every time they cleaned it, a little bit of detail was erased. So the Irish and French governments pooled their funding and built this plexiglass shield around the work, but people are now kissing the plexiglass, which is a lot less harmful, but at least people get to express themselves. But
Suzanne Legault would like to know if there is a list and whether we could have the list of the names being mentioned in your presentation, the architect, the sculptor. I guess everybody is mentioned in your book, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Somebody would like, Barbara Quinlan would like to know if we could show, Natasha, maybe you can find it easily, the photo of the tomb of Jim Morrison again, please.
Let
I
me
know
try.
I should linger a little bit longer at each one of these. The details are, I've got a little anecdote for those who are big fans of Jim Morrison. Again, another advantage about living in Los Angeles, I was able to interview Ray Manzarek, as well as Bill Siddons, who was the first manager of the Doors, and Alain Ronay, who was a UCLA fellow student with Jim Morrison in the film department. And Alain Ronay and Bill Siddons both were at Morrison's burial. It was very small. Agnes Varda, the filmmaker, was there as well. And initially, there was no headstone. They wanted total anonymity for Morrison. They were very concerned that the paparazzi and everyone would just mob the funeral and everything. So not until the family installed this headstone and they put a bronze plaque on the piece with his name and a Greek phrase that translated to his own self be true. And you can see there are very tall structures around it, very difficult. Many people may have heard that there was a great controversy because people were putting graffiti on other tombs in order for people to find Morrison's burial place. And it was very disturbing to family members. So they now have kind of barricades around the cemetery plot. And on the July 3rd anniversary of his death, thousands upon thousands of pilgrims come to pay their respects. So the police are there kind of getting people to, line in one by one to kind of have some crowd control. But it's probably one of the most popular tombs in the cemetery.
Betty Perlish is asking if you can talk about the Sarah Bernhardt's gravesite.
Yes, it was so difficult. We could have probably had a lecture for the rest of the evening. She, in fact, designed her own tomb. It is a low gray, kind of looks like a chapel front. And inside this lovely arch is a little miniature coffin. And as for many of you may know, that she rehearsed for many of her dramatic roles, and she slept in a coffin at one point in her career to kind of, like she said, get in the drama mood. But it has wonderful gold leaf, very large letters, Sarah Bernhardt, difficult to find. There's tall shrubbery around it, and it sits behind a large tomb. But I'm trying to think, again, all of these are on the map, which I should mention for visitors to Paris. When I first was there, the administrators gave me this little Xeroxed map, and I was so excited. There were all the little points that showed where everybody was. But then you get to the division, that little point is in the middle of about 80 headstones. So you have no idea really what it looks like. And for that reason, after I designed the map, I designed a GPS app for Android and iPhones, so that literally with the satellite, you can find it, because it is, half the fun is getting lost in Père-Lachaise. It's never dull. There's always something marvelous and wonderful to discover. But all of these things are designated on the map, and it'll help you save time if you have just a short window. And Sarah Bernhardt's is not easy to find. So
Marcia is asking, what do you think makes this cemetery the most visited in the world?
There's several reasons. I think from a historic perspective, it was the very first. It was radical at the time for people to be buried outside of the church. It was kind of like a guarantee of access to God, that you were either near the altar or within the church graveyard. So to be outside of that was a kind of a religious revolution. Plus, it also shifted that feeling to nature, and not this kind of scariness about a cemetery, which now I think with the pandemic and fears of death, people are trying to go back to that trope that it's scary. Well, no, it's a natural progression. It's part of life. So, and of course, and the other obvious thing is, I don't think there is any other cemetery in the world that has the number of high-profile celebrities. Not only I've chosen specifically the people in the arts, but they're Napoleon's generals, they're famous scientists, they're leaders of French government. There's a few presidents there. So it really is probably, on many levels, for celebrity, for history, for revolutionary breakthroughs in cemetery design. And it's
so we have a couple of comments of people who are really excited because they have bought your book and they really are looking forward to reading it. And somebody else who love the fact that there are bats, and she's a fellow bat lover, and she's very happy that that you actually showed your favorite ones. Somebody else, Carol Griffin Kurtz, says to you that she's absolutely proud of your success because she was in high school with you.
Yes,
so it's almost like a high school reunion. Dominique Lallemand is asking whether the book is going to be translated into French. Very good question.
I'm going to, hopefully, I will send this recording to my publisher, who I feel very strongly, it is our plan to partner with a French publisher to, again, I just had the app translated into French, but I think our goal definitely is to have it published in French. That is the goal.
And Dominique has a follow-up question, which is almost the same as the one from Jim Bullock and Barbara Price. So I'm going to regroup all of those three questions together. Basically, how much does it cost to be buried in Père-Lachaise? And how do you qualify? Are there new burials being made there? And basically, how can one arrange to be buried there?
Excellent questions. And it has changed over time. The basic principle is you either must be born in Paris, your family has a mausoleum already established there, or you die there. One of the ways that Jim Morrison qualified, having passed away in Paris, and he had lived there for about a year. Napoleon designed it for all people. It's a municipal cemetery, so it's open to all. However, it's become a bit gentrified and getting a bit elitist in that it's becoming increasingly more expensive because there aren't that many plots available. There is a waiting list if you don't qualify in one of those kind of headings. And so to purchase one outright, it's about $15,000. I think it's 15,000 euros. So it's maybe could be as much as $20,000 for a substantial plot. The very small ones, the 1 meter, are about 2,200. So it's, unfortunately, I've been doing some reading lately, and it's become almost out of the reach for a typical Parisian because it's become so expensive. So people are having to look for burial outside of the city. I think that I answer all three of those. Of how do you, yes, I think that it's the pricing, what are the qualifications, and it's very competitive. So, but there is an interesting new approach that's happening. As I mentioned before, if you don't pay your rent, you can be disinterred, and they make the plot available to the next person. They're taking many of the chapel style mausoleums, which usually maybe had 2 or 3 family members, and they're recreating it and repurposing it, putting small cremation niches within that, that chapel style. So what ordinarily would house maybe 2 or 3 people now can take as many as 15 or 20 because they're just the little niches. So they're they know that Père-Lachaise is popular. They're trying to accommodate people.
And I can, to James, I think somebody else was asking about new burials. I was there last year in January 2019 for the burial of a young teenager of 17-year-old at the Père-Lachaise. So yes, there are burials nowadays, but like Carolyn mentioned, you need to have a plot before you can do that. A question from Suzanne, who's asking, who is the subject and who is the sculptor of the next to last slide, hooded figure, just before the semi-nude marble damsel? That's very precise.
Yes, okay. This is right, as a matter of fact, this is just beyond Colette and Louis Visconti on the Avenue Principale going up to O'More. This is a very elaborate, the artist Paul Baudry, and his brother is an architect who designed the entire tomb. This is a small piece in part of a triumvirate kind of design. I'm going to look quickly to see who the sculptor was. Let's see, this is on the tour 1 for those who have the book. Let me see here, tour 1. Jean-Jacques-Ami Baudry. The eye level is a female figure overwhelmed with sadness. She leans toward an artist's palette and brush rendered in bronze. The monument is a brilliant collaboration. Baudry's architect brother, Ambrose, and a friend, Maurice Jean-Antonin Mercier, designed the overall tomb. The colleague Paul Dubois executed the bronze bust atop the base in the center, and Mercier created the 2 bronze figures. The woman on the lower left, which is this woman, representing the douleur or grief, and the other a highly animated winged figure depicting fame about to place a crown of laurels on Baudry's head. So this one is quite remarkable, and this is so dramatic. This is atypical of the grieving female figure, and the modeling in the bronze, I mean, her right arm and the fabric and everything, it's just extraordinary. So yes, you pointed out.
We have this question from Jonathan that I think he sent before the event about the fact that he visited Père-Lachaise and he noticed people left metro tickets on the graves, in particular of Proust and others. He noticed the same phenomena at the Montparnasse Cemetery as well. And he heard the story according to which the metro tickets on Serge Gainsbourg's tomb were a tribute to his song Le Poinçonneur des Lilas. But the practice seems to be more widespread. Is there, according to you, a story behind the metro tickets?
Well, but I've been trying to find out, because typically people like to leave a memento. I mean, at graves, the whole thought behind either a flower or a stone, as in the Jewish tradition, is to let the person know that you've been there and you have visited and paid your respects. But there's something wonderful about a metro ticket, which kind of says, let's travel. You know, is it traveling in the past? I know Proust's tomb is covered in metro tickets with little chestnuts on top of them. So it's, you know, the meanings can be, you know, endless, I guess. But again, it's also wishing the deceased person a happy journey, a safe journey into the afterlife, wherever they're headed. And so I don't know specifically what the significance is of the metro, other than it's usually, everyone always has a metro ticket or 10 in their pocket in Paris. So sometimes you want to leave something behind. If you don't have a little pebble or a flower, they leave a metro pack, you know, ticket. So that's my best guess.
Judy is asking if you could explain in more detail about the intersection between the sacred and the religious with the secular celebration of these individual lives.
Well, I guess up until I was having a conversation about, you know, the Romantic era was the 19th century was really a rare period in history overall. The Romantics, this moving away from the kind of darkness and suffering. It was just in writing, in art, in sculpture. And a lot of this was dominated by the church, which was, you know, this is how you behave. This is, you know, the church had the structure. And when the pantheistic thinking, which was not exactly agnostic or atheist, it was just more about nature. And this seemed a little probably foreign to the structure of the church. And again, the church was about, you know, you had to pay your way to glory. And people who didn't have the finances to be able to afford being placed in the church, probably it appealed much more to them by, you know, a stroll in the garden and seeing that as a way to revere a loved one that had passed. I probably am not the greatest on religious history, but that's my own study on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Somebody would like to know more about your collaboration with your photographer. Did you set up the shots together? How did you approach taking your own photos?
Oh, well, I was mentioning Natasha earlier when we were going through the photographs that picture of Chopin that Joe Cornish took, the original picture is a 35mm slide for those who have all the digital age, that was small color film that you had to go and have processed, and it came in a little cardboard frame. I initially shot with a Nikon SLR FG, this lovely little small camera. I shot mainly in black and white. At the time, Joe Cornish, as a matter of fact, was working in Washington, D.C. as an assistant to a friend of mine, Mike Mitchell, and his focus was rock and roll portraiture. Joe had never shot, you know, any of this kind of work, but when I invited him, he had moved back to London. This launched his entire career into landscape photography. He is now the leading landscape photographer for the British National Trust. He lives outside of London in Yorkshire now. You can Google him. We've just stayed friends. I think for the first couple of years, I worked at a museum. I would scrape enough money together to pay his film. We would get enough money to get airfare to get there. And so we figure we spent about 80 hours in the cemetery. And of course, we grew in technology. We started getting digital cameras, and he has a beautiful Hasselblad that I envy. I use a Canon EOS 70D. But again, showing you 1982, a Kodak 35 millimeter slide is as breathtaking as something we've taken with the Hasselblad. So that's the kind of arc of our photography history together.
That's wonderful to know that you took that, and while he has a Hasselblad, and oh wow, I'm very impressed, I must say. And then Beryl mentioned that when there was a kind of seance going on when she visited. It was a tomb of a mystic. She doesn't remember who it was, but seemed to have a devoted following. And
Yes.
whether you have any idea of any who could be on the tomb?
I know the tomb, the name. My other friend who knows this, he lauds it all the time. I keep thinking Karnak, but that's not it. I remember you were not to take photographs of it. When I was there early in the 80s, it was frowned on. It's a mystic's tomb. It's large like a stone, and his bust is set in, always tons and tons of flowers and people, laying their hands on it, but it was discouraged to not take photographs. It was spooky. I mean, I wasn't about to do anything that was going to cause me any kind of, curses or anything like that. But I do recall that one. And I saw something pop up about Augustus St. Gaudens. And no, his work is not in Père-Lachaise, but if you go to Rock Creek, if that person happens to be in Washington, in Rock Creek Cemetery, there is a beautiful Augustus St. Gaudens sculpture of grief, and she's seated. I believe it is the wife of a well-known dignitary in Washington. That is her memorial. So I'm very familiar with his work, and there is one in Washington, but not in Père-Lachaise.
There is a very interesting question from Balaj. Question is about: is there any tribute to Balzac's characters who he has buried in his oeuvre in Père-Lachaise? And why is it familiar? Because in War and Peace, Natasha Rostova is one of the heroines, and in the Orthodox Church, and I'm Russian Orthodox, I have seen old ladies lighting a candle for Natasha Rostova, who is obviously Tolstoy heroine, but
Yes.
not a real person, right? So is there any equivalent of a tribute of Balzac's characters that he in his work has buried in Père-Lachaise?
Right. Well, the quote that I mentioned early on was from Père Goriot. I mean, it's from the Comédie Humaine. It's literally something that he has the character saying. There is in the front of his monument a wonderful bronze volume with a pen on top of it, and people leave coins. Nothing specific about there's always notes. There's always, in front of every writer's tomb, there are legions of letters, and I've never read them or translated them, but I don't know, there could specifically be ones about the characters, but nothing, that references, another tomb in the cemetery, or, nothing on the tomb itself that illustrates one of the characters. But the volume that's there is to represent his, 2000 novel Comédie Humaine. So that would be one illustration.
Another question from Sally Beth Bumbray. She wants to know if you have any idea about how many Americans, famous or otherwise, are buried in Père-Lachaise.
There was a lot of expats who moved there. And I would say, of course, obviously Jim Morrison. There are 70,000 graves and 1 million people buried there. There's 2 more million in the ossuary. I don't know what percentage. I think it's fairly small because, again, it's the expat population, and it was a very popular French cemetery. So I think the dominating, residents there are French. But I'm trying to think. I have the list on the map. Let's see here. Again, these are René Lalique, Marie Laurencin, Marcel Marceau. It's all the French. As well, it should be. So
there's a question actually about Lalique. Can you talk about the René Lalique tomb and the gem embedded in the tomb, which was stolen several times?
Well, it's a beautiful crystal Lalique crystal crucifix, and it's set right in. It's embedded. I think it's still there. I've been there several times and never seen it stolen. I do know that things get. Ted Lapidou, the couturier, his plaque was stolen. His face was taken off of his family tomb, and things are stolen all the time. But it's quite beautiful, and I'm surprised that it even exists because it is beautiful Lalique crystal, and it's probably about this big, and it sits in the center of the front of the tomb. So, but it's easy to find his tomb. It's kind of in an open clearing. So.
Meredith is asking if you can give some more information about the Tristan and Isolde tomb.
Well, I'm thinking you mean Heloise and Abelard?
Well, I would have thought it was Heloise and Abelard myself, because I don't think Tristan and Isolde, it being first a legend and second opera by Wagner. So maybe she meant Heloise and Abelard, yeah.
Well, again, it's kind of questionable whether or not, I mean, even Molière and La Fontaine, they do feel that they found the ashes they were in previously in a church. Heloise and Abelard, we're talking the 12th century. So whether or not they really got their remains, but they built this beautiful, and the thing is, the sad thing about this beautiful Gothic chapel is that the design is so unbelievably top heavy that they are constantly having to recreate. The bottom part is always got scaffolding and everything. It's far too heavy. The lower part is not strong enough to support it, so they're constantly having to repair it. But it's quite beautiful. The 2 figures are reclining on a bier. There's a lovely, the dog is a symbol of fidelity in funerary symbolism, and that's at the feet of Abelard. Well, the story is he was an older monk, abbot. She was a very young 16, 14-year-old, and they had an affair, and it was very scandalous. He was castrated. She went to a nunnery, and it's a very sad, tragic story, but it's a big visitation place. But again, it was a big draw, and the show certainly knew that. And again, whether or not that's really their remains, that was certainly, what the claim was, that they did find their remains and they were moved there. So.
We have a question about the Holocaust. There is a more recent section memorializing the Holocaust with some extraordinary sculpture. Can you comment on that?
Yes, it is in the, I have it on tour 3. It is on the far, I would say, southeastern wall, and you come down. As a matter of fact, it's just beyond Gertrude Stein's tomb, and you kind of round the corner. It's an entire stretch of maybe about 500 yards, and there are memorials to Belsen, Auschwitz, and the sculptures. It's really worth spending some time there. They are extremely moving. They're beautifully crafted. They're very tragic. I mean, you can imagine they are illustrating figures struggling. And I believe that I have, I'm trying to remember if I do have one image that Joe took in the book of a very striking representation of one of those. But yes, there's probably maybe a dozen sculptures commemorating the different camps and different groups that were there. Yes.
A question regarding the section in your book in which you have conversation with the deceased, like for instance, Chopin and Piaf. Were they a compilation of your research on these people, or did you feel you were receiving actual messages from the dead? And thank you for your book. It was a great read.
Well, I gave myself a very rigid assignment. I mean, it lasted for about 20 years that I would not read any book unless it was either by or about someone buried in Père-Lachaise. So you can imagine my reading list was fantastic. You know, Edith Piaf, Modigliani, all of them incredibly tragic, incredibly romantic. So I took a lot from those books. I really wanted to be able to echo their exact voice. I wanted them, you know, I was asking questions. What was your family life? Did they agree with you being an artist? What were your struggles? How did you overcome them? Unfortunately, many of them were alcoholics or drug addicts or, you know, you name it. And they had a lot of struggle, but they were all passionate. And I had the good fortune, again, as I said earlier, I met Oscar Wilde's grandson. So I got some wonderful feedback that he was saying at one point that he thought that Oscar Wilde would have made a great late night TV host because he loved to talk with people. So you could imagine him having his own kind of Johnny Carson show or something like that. And that speaking with many members of the Doors, I was able to find out, you know, what their feelings. I mean, Jim Morrison had this incredibly outrageous reputation, and yet he was a very serious man of literature. He studied a lot of obscure German aesthetic writers and so forth. And again, but he was haunted by his alcoholism and drug addiction. So it was very tragic. But everyone of those 8 characters that I interviewed, I don't think I sensationalized anything. I did kind of get into some nitty-gritty conversations with Edith Piaf about her, you know, love of men, and she's pretty outspoken about her passion. So thank you. That was my most enjoyable part of the book. I mean, I really.
A question from James who wants to know if you have some favorite cemeteries in the US.
Oh, well, that right off the top of my head, Savannah, Georgia, the Bonaventure Cemetery. If you can imagine transporting Père-Lachaise to a southern plantation or the Wilmington River with Spanish moss draping from the trees above. It's astounding. It was built in the early 1830s. So it's about, you know, it's a little bit after the opening of Père-Lachaise, but it's just breathtaking. And you know, it's interesting. I had never been to a cemetery before other than my grandfather's burial at Arlington. I wasn't a big cemetery person, wise, but ever since Père-Lachaise, I've been to Mount Auburn is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is the first garden style cemetery in the US. It is magnificent. There's one in Brooklyn that is on my bucket list. I've been to, again, in Washington, DC, Oak Hill Cemetery is on R Street in Georgetown. Lovely, sweet cemetery. As a matter of fact, the Corcoran family tomb is there. When we did the memorial for the Corcoran, when it closed, we literally took a wreath to the family mausoleum to kind of pay homage to William Wilson Corcoran. And of course, New Orleans has astounding ones. I've been to the old Dolores Mission in San Francisco, very old Spanish cemetery there. California, oh my goodness, Hollywood Forever. They even have Toto, the little dog from The Wizard of Oz, is buried there.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, when I go to a town, I usually try to make a detour to visit the cemetery. It's a wonderful display of the history of the city. It really is.
that's true. So I must say that there was one photo I saw in your things today of an angel that reminded me of the angel at Oak Hill that you can see through when you turn at the end of our street, just about to go down. And I took a beautiful photo there that Oak Hill, the people in Oak Hill actually then after that used later on. So it was funny. So I have two questions from Josh. The first one is, what can you tell us about the statue of Christiane Delattre, the beautiful angel pointing a finger skyward? And then he also wants to know, can you mention Le Mur des Fédérés? And this comment is, a cemetery is always a place of death, but it is more rare for people to be killed in one.
Right. I don't really know many details of the angel with the finger pointing up. I'm not, unfortunately, I have a dear friend who has researched every single sculpture and stained glass in the entire cemetery. And I use his book, Steve Soper, if you want to Google his book, it's quite wonderful. But let me just see, yes, the Mur de Feu, the wall, as I understand, the Communards wall.
Yeah.
In May 28, 1871, 147 fédérés, or combatants of the Paris Commune, were executed and buried in a mass grave at the foot of the wall. French leftists, socialists, and communists in particular see the wall as a symbol of the people's struggle for their liberty and ideals. So yes, I mean, Père-Lachaise really documents such a broad arc of history, from the Holocaust areas to the Communards wall. Yes, I mean, death comes in so many ways, through tragedy, through just people passing. I mean, there are graves from the I can't remember the name, the Bataclan, the
Bataclan, yeah.
Bataclan, the cartoonist from
Charlie Hebdo.
Yes, is there. So it's just, that's why, one of the reasons why I created the book is that when you're walking through Père-Lachaise, yes, it's beautiful, but to know what you're really looking at, and to kind of take a moment to really embrace witnessing and being a part of this history there, and the symbols and what it represents. And it's such a rich, it's again, what it's made me such an, I mean, over 30 years, every couple of months I get to tear away to go to Paris. It's just, I'm an addict for life.
I must say, one of the surprise I had when I went to that burial in January 2019 was along the boulevard. I hadn't been in a few years, okay? And so now the outside of the cemetery itself, there is a wall which lists absolutely every single Parisian who died in World War I. And it's a very long wall. I mean, very long and full of names. So that is quite impressive. We have a couple more questions. Actually, one was if the photos you showed today were the photos from your book. Still, another photo from your another question linked to your book. Do you have an app or website about this, because it has been so interesting?
Yes, cityofimmortals.com. It has many sections. It has the history, the design. There's a section about the book. There's a section just of all the press reviews. And I have to hat tip to a lot of French journalists who have interviewed me, have done some really lovely stories. And there's a section on the map, there's a section on the book, and a section on the app. And the app, again, I just mentioned, it just came out in French. So my goal is to go for the audio next. I keep adding to all the elements. I have a wonderful app developer based in New Zealand who we're having a lot of fun building this. So, and the photographs that are in the book are also in the app. So you can, it's very helpful to know what you're looking for. Again, it's 107 acres. It's a labyrinth. So to have the image to help you locate the shape of the tomb and so forth. And many of the images, there's a few I think I added in the slideshow that may not be in the book, but there's something similar. So
So there is a last comment I want to read because it's a very interesting comment, and take the last question from Lillian. So Dominic said that there is a beautiful sculpture by Sarah Bernhardt at the Women's Museum in Washington, D.C., Après la tempête, after the storm, which depicts a Breton peasant woman cradling the body of her grandson who has been caught in a fisherman's nets. Sarah Bernhardt had seen this woman on the seashore and was moved by her story, which ended tragically with the death of the child. So we know about Sarah Bernhardt being a sculptor. That's a very nice. Thank you very much, Dominique.
Yes.
And Liliane is asking, have you ever had an encounter with Rafael, who apparently gives impromptu tours and probably knows the cemetery like the back of his hand?
Yes, Rafael and I have met over several years, and it's been uncanny. He's quite a character, and whenever we see each other, we've helped each other find, it's like a treasure hunt. We're always looking for a different tomb, and we're filling in the blanks. And last time I was able to help him find a tomb that he had long been looking for. And in the past years, I think the last time I saw him was 2018, but I first met him in like 2010. So yes, you see him, give my best to Rafael.
This is great because it's in between finding some high school friends and some people, you know, from the cemetery.
It's been so wonderful.
That an event on Zoom could be, you know, could have so much interaction and meetings. And Lillian also recommended, in case you haven't visited it, to visit the Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, apparently also for your list of cemetery in the US. Well, we had a great event, a wonderful event. I learned a lot myself, even though I've been to Père-Lachaise quite a few times, not as in depth as you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.